these big multifamily buildings are very complicated, and you need a very well-trained crew to pull that off without us finding something later. I have a favorite phrase: with the last thing you want is lawyers doing your quality control.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk Podcast, a regular discussion with building industry professionals and other folks. This is Senior Editor Patrick McCone. Today I'm joined by attorney Tyler Berding. You can find the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk Podcast and the original Fine Homebuilding Podcast at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. You can leave feedback and ask questions there too. Tyler, thanks very much for being on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Can you please tell me about your law firm? You have a specialty that I think our listeners will find interesting.
Yeah, Berding & Weil is about a 35-year-old law firm that we mostly handle construction-related issues, mostly on behalf of owners of buildings. And we have been litigating and doing that for, like I said, about 35 years.
How did you get into dealing with building problems and defects?
I have a background personally in construction of my own, and not professionally, but just doing things, building things. And when I got into law, I happened to start with a law firm that did a lot of defensive surety companies that bond contractors. So that I did that for about 6 years. And then I got into another firm that began representing owners of buildings. And we began looking at defects in buildings and construction failures and litigating those when they couldn't negotiate a repair.
In an introductory email, you mentioned that you expect the defects, construction defects, to be a bigger issue in the near future. Can you please tell me why you think that is?
Yeah, within the last 3 or 4 years, with the pandemic creating supply chain problems and a shortage of trained labor, in the face of a hot real estate market where builders could sell anything they can put on the market, we always find in those kind of situations that rushed construction is not necessarily good construction. And the shortage of trained labor is probably the single biggest problem that builders face when they build complicated buildings like multifamily apartment houses and condominiums. And the untrained labor doesn't know how to assemble these buildings properly, and there's just not enough quality control inspectors on those jobs to catch all the little and big issues that come up. So as these buildings go on the market, they get subject to the weather. We find leaks, we find water trapped in the buildings, and causes various problems. But it primarily it's when you have a period like we've had over the last 3 years, you find that the problems are exacerbated.
I would describe, and I think most people would, California, where you practice, as to be a bastion of code enforcement. That California takes building inspections very seriously. I would think that good inspections would uncover these defects before they were a problem. Is that simply not the case?
It really isn't. Yes, we have strong codes, and we look to make we hope that the builders will meet the codes. But code violations aren't the primary issues that we face. Those kinds of problems that we're talking about, window flashings, lapping waterproofing paper properly, putting the right sealant in the cracks in the joints between two components. All the waterproofing issues are, especially in a complicated building like a condominium building that has a lot of junctures and joints, they don't have enough. First of all, the builder doesn't have enough quality control inspectors to stand over every workman and watch them put those things in place and assemble the building properly. the workman's not trained properly to do it, then we find they make mistakes, and there's just not enough oversight on those jobs to catch that. And even less so, the building inspector comes out there after those things have all been completed. They're not looking at those little tiny joints, and they can't see under the siding to what happened with the window flashings, and so they're going to miss it. The codes are strong, but the building departments are understaffed. There's no way they can get out there and see all of that. And water takes advantage of those issues over time and catches and causes the buildings to trap the moisture and cause rot and mold problems over the years afterwards.
You mentioned it. Bulk water, I've heard, is the biggest problem. Is that indeed true? And is it the number of problems or the dollars involved? I'm guessing it's both.
It's both, but there's really two kinds of moisture problems that we find. First of all, liquid water coming into a dwelling is caught very quickly, because the owner sees it. It's puddling on the floor, it's dripping from the ceiling, wherever it's coming from. Those kind of problems are addressed very quickly and often by the builder. And if they're going to do that, they usually do that in the first couple of years of ownership. If the leak is there enough to let water come into the interior of a home, they're going to catch it, because the owner's not going to ignore that. They're going to see it. The more insidious kind of moisture intrusion is the kind that gets into the wall cavity but doesn't have enough moisture there to follow all the way into the unit or the home. And it stays in that wall cavity, and the vapor or the moisture begins to rot the wood frame members that are there, and the structural sheathing and other components that are inside those walls, and begin to invade the structure and cause long-term problems down the road. Those aren't caught right away.
That can take, I'm sure, years or a decade to show up, right?
At least. We represent both ends of this problem, both from the construction side and then the rehab side at the end. When they're 30, 40 years old, we're still representing them. And we're finding, as we begin to take these buildings apart to fix things that are obvious, we find much hidden damage that's not obvious. And the job that maybe had been projected at a couple $1 million quickly balloons to 6 or 8 million, and the owners are shocked and stunned. But has been hidden there for maybe 20, 30 years.
You know, in the residential sector, there are like limitations of how far, you can go back for claims to a builder. Are there similar rules in commercial construction? Are the time frames longer?
No. There's still, in California, you can't litigate against a builder after 10 years at the longest. There are even shorter periods for certain things. And that applies to commercial buildings as well as residential buildings. The residential buildings have tighter time frames. Some components are shorter due to statutory enactments a few years ago. But the residential buildings have a singular problem, and that is they're often owned by people that don't know how to maintain them. You give a very complicated building to a group of individual owners, like a condominium. They may hire management, but management isn't often skilled in facilities and how to maintain them, how to repair them. And the owners are certainly not skilled in detecting the kind of things we're talking about. So in those kinds of buildings, those problems can often be deferred for many, many years until they are discovered. And unfortunately, it's the owners that own them then that end up paying the bill for that 20 or 30 years of deterioration.
That was my next question, is who's on the hook for all these repairs? And the answer is the building owner is the short answer, right?
That's right. The builder's long out of the picture. The building owners are stuck with it. I mean, look at the most famous example we have currently is the Champlain Towers collapse in Surfside, Florida. Those owners were presented with a $17 million repair bill. And actually, they balked initially and didn't want to pay it and put it off for a couple of years. And then they started repairing it, and but by then it was too late to deal with it. But the owners, don't want to raise their assessments. They're suspicious of people who come in and say you have to spend money you hadn't planned on. They fight with their boards of directors to over increased assessments. But I think more importantly, the people who are managing that building often do not have the technical expertise to detect things early enough when they can be fixed with relatively inexpensively.
What do you think, and I know what you're going to say, what do you think contractors should be doing to protect themselves from defect lawsuits?
Hire quality work people. Get the best, and I mean, I analogize this to union trained, and that's certainly unions do train workers. They have apprentice programs, but there's very few of them compared to the demand for them. But you can get skilled work people who are not necessarily from unions, and you need to find the most skilled people that you can find. Now, they don't, again, economics plays a part. It depends on how much emphasis you put on quality and avoiding litigation versus getting the maximum profit you can out of the job. It's a balancing act. And I sympathize with the contractors because we see them on the other side of our cases a lot. They can't find the talent needed to put these buildings together properly. They'll argue with me on that, of course, and they'll say, "Oh no, we have high quality people." But the discoveries that we make when we do our inspections of these buildings say otherwise. There's things left undone or not done according to manufacturer's specifications, not done according to industry standards that should have been done that way and allow water to get into the interior of a wall. And we open up the walls, we find that stuff.
Are there things other than bulk water and moisture issues that present a problem? What about insects? I'm sure you have lots of bugs in California.
Actually, that's more of an East Coast thing, actually. We
because it's dry where you are.
Yeah, it's dry. I think if you went up to the Northwest, you might find more of it. But where we are, it's fairly arid, more so in the last 5 years than we would like, but it has been. But soil issues are a big problem in California. Foundation issues where soil was not compacted properly. Builders love to build on hillsides, especially custom homes, and they hang them off the edge of the hill with piers that maybe don't go far enough down, and we begin to get subsidence and we begin to get differential settlement and cracking. So soil issues are another big issue in California that we see all the time. Bay fill around the edges of San Francisco Bay, which we were just soil put over bay mud and compacted sort of, and then they build houses on top of that or buildings on top of that. And a number of years later, you begin to see those buildings settle differentially. Doors won't open, windows stick, cracks in walls, and it's because the bay mud is like jello, and they put a thin layer of soil on top of it and build on top of it. So choice of location, because land is so valuable in California, people try anything to find a place to build and very often don't make the right choices.
You mentioned the lack of skilled workers as partly to blame for the defects that your firm deals with. What do you think we should be doing as a society to encourage people to take up trade work? Is there an easy answer in your mind?
In the Pleistocene, when I went to high school, we had auto shop, we had metal shop, we had wood shop, and young people were trained to at least look at those trades as possible alternatives. With the huge emphasis we put on a college education now, we've lost some of the focus on getting people into the trades and training them properly. High schools and community colleges need to do more to bring those programs in. States need to see to get them funded, to get those people trained who probably aren't going to do their best work in college or don't need it. Those trades, they can make a nice living in those trades: plumbing, carpentry, metalwork, roofing, all of those things. They're dying for those workers. And right now, we're filling those slots with a lot of immigrants who come in. They do have the skills and they can do it. They're just not enough. And our young people, I think we do them a disservice when we say the only way you can be successful is if you get a 4-year college degree. And I totally disagree with that. I think they can be very successful, and we need to help guide them, some of these young folks, into trade programs in community colleges and high schools.
What about existing tradespeople? What should we be doing to train them to make them not make the mistakes that you talk about?
They need to go and in a sense, go back to school in a way. Manufacturers will provide programs to show them how to install their building products properly. We have a lot of manufactured building products now that are not as robust as we built them 100 years ago when redwood was readily available, or any of the older building materials. We're now substituting a lot of manufactured wood products. We're using sealants that have to be installed just in the right way. They can't come in contact with other sealants that are incompatible. But those things aren't readily known in the field. And those things where manufacturers put out materials and occasionally, and not maybe occasionally, often have seminars where they'll talk about how to install it. They want them to know how to install their materials.
It's in everyone's interest for it to work, right? Everyone wants it to work.
Absolutely. They want to sell the material, but they also don't want to get sued when it doesn't work. So train them and do it right. And it's not that hard to do it right, but if they don't know how to do it, they're not going to do it right.
Given your work, Tyler, I'm guessing it would be tough for you to trust most tradespeople know what they're doing. Can you talk about that? You mentioned your own construction projects, not professionally, but it's obviously an interest of yours.
The contractors that I've worked with personally on my own projects, I've known for years and years and years, and I know them to be skilled at what they do. I've watched their work, and I trust them to do what they should do. That's a relationship that's kind of rare. Often a contractor on a big project, my projects aren't big, they're small, but on a big project, contractors have a few workers that they've had with them for years and years, small crew, but they need to expand that crew on a big job. So where do they get the extra people? They either have friends of friends, they go to Home Depot and find them in front of Home Depot. There are various ways of getting them, but they don't necessarily have a lot of experience with them and know what their capabilities are. And they don't have enough people on the job to provide the necessary oversight to make up for lack of skill. The more skilled the worker is, the less you have to worry about oversight.
When you're out and about driving around Southern California, do you notice the construction work? I'm sure you do. Do you like what you see?
Actually, I just bought a house, a little house up where our grandkids live, and it was in a new project. It was kind of an interesting experience for me because I'd never bought a brand new home from a developer before, and they had a very interesting program where they would bring the buyer out, and the buyers could look at the building as it progressed. They had a frame walk, they had an interior walk at different times. They gave you a big roll of blue tape, and you stick a blue tape piece on anything you think needed attention. Now, I know framing, and I know electrical, and I know plumbing, so I was kind of their worst nightmare walking through there, I suppose. But they did a very fine job. The crews they had, this is production housing, and the crews they had, from my perspective, knew what they were doing. And then they had a warranty period afterwards where they had a small crew would come back, and where all those pieces of blue tape were, they would come and redo it. And they were very, very skilled people, because I watched them. The washer and dryer we had was you usually have the washer on the left and the dryer on the right, I think, because the doors have to open so you can get in. They had it reversed. I think they built the house to a mirror image plan, and they had
right?
it reversed.
Yeah.
So the doors opened out, and you'd have to bring your laundry
And that would
around.
be a pain.
Terrible pain. So I obviously told them about it, and they didn't hesitate. They came out, pulled out the washer dryer, and they had to go take the wall off to swap the plumbing and the electrical inside, all the cabinetry off, put it all back the way it was intended. Perfect job. And I watched them do it. And these workmen were very skilled people. So if a developer or a builder can find crews like that, but they're rare. You can't find people that are multitaskers like these guys were. It's just not there, and that's where I go back to, we need more training.
What about more generally? You mentioned your own house, that they did a good job. What about, my understanding is your firm does predominantly multifamily. What about those buildings you see when you're out and about?
Well, first of all, they don't let us get very close. when they got fences around them, and we can only look at the hard to look at from that. But when we do get retained, because there have been notable problems, we take them apart, or take parts of them apart, and that's when we discover stuff that's below the surface. And we do that every day of the week almost, at different buildings, different places, and it always comes down to the same thing: somebody didn't know what they were doing when they put a particular component together. The building was not assembled the way the manufacturers or even the architect intended. We rarely find, let's just put it this way, design problems are much less of a problem than execution problems. The plans usually say what should be done and how to do it, and they're sufficiently detailed in a big project that someone who knows how to read drawings and looks at them would know how to put that building together. Unfortunately, the people in the field often aren't even given the drawings. If they're given them, they may not know how to read them. And there's nobody out there to make sure that the drawings are being followed in every single instance. If you're talking about a 150-unit condominium project, you have hundreds and hundreds of component parts and places that have to be assembled properly. And there's just not enough people on that job that either know what they're doing or have the oversight to make sure they know what they're doing. That's really the problem. These big multifamily buildings are very complicated, and you need a very well-trained crew to pull that off without us finding something later. I have a favorite phrase: "What the last thing you want is lawyers doing your quality control."
I see why you say that.
Do your own quality control. Don't make us come out there with experts who are going to tear the building open and find all kind of stuff in there. And then you do find code violations. You do find other things. Once you're opening the building because it's leaking, you're going to find a lot of other stuff in there. And the problem just gets worse for the builder.
So anyone who listens to this show with regularity knows I send questions ahead of time to my guests. But this is one I haven't thought to ask you, but I'm going to ask anyway. The Millennium Tower, I'm guessing you would love that as a client. What the heck's going to happen with that? We should maybe tell folks what it is to start with.
Well, the Millennium Tower is a high-rise, I think 39-story residential condominium building in downtown San Francisco, right across from the Salesforce Tower. It's tilting, and it when they first noticed it, it was about 7 inches out of plumb. It is now 26 inches out of plumb. It's tilting. We actually did represent some of the individual owners and settled that on their behalf. The Homeowners Association was given a very large sum of money to make repairs that engineers said would arrest the tilting of the building. So they began that work, probably a year and a half ago now. And what it was if the building was tilting this way, they were going to sink deep piles down into they call bedrock, and at least would arrest the building. And then their hope was that if the other side that wasn't supported would settle, the building would straighten itself up. Now, to me, that was a remarkable plan that I thought had maybe not the greatest chance of succeeding, but nevertheless, I am not a building engineer, and we were out of there by then and just watching. The problem with Millennium, it had a unique design. The foundation piers, instead of going large piers all the way down 100 or 50 feet into very competent rock. It's not really bedrock in the way we think about it. It's not like a giant stone down there. It's just more competent. That area of San Francisco was bayfill. It was all bay at one time, and as from the gold rush on, they'd throw crap out there. Old ships would sink there. Everything you can imagine. It was a dump, and they'd fill it up, and then they'd put dirt on top and started building on it. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier, although a little more complicated. So Millennium Tower's design decided we don't need to put these piers down all the way to bedrock. We'll put more of them, but we'll put them down maybe 2 times or 3 times as many. They don't need to go down as far. So they did that. Well, unfortunately, that was not the best plan, because that's what they believe led to this. Well, they know that's what led to the tilting. So they've been out there now drilling large pier holes down on that one side, and they're putting lots of them along there. I don't know how many. And they discovered that the tilting was accelerating as they were working. So they thought, oh boy, we better. So they stopped that. Now they're back to some other way of doing it with fewer piers. And I don't know where it stands right at the moment, but I know that they're still out there and have been for a year and a half or more now, trying to arrest the settlement of that building. It's not to the point where something like Champlain Towers, where you have to evacuate people, that nobody thinks it's going to fall over. But, it definitely hurts owner value to know this. Those were very expensive condominiums. A lot of celebrities live there. But they're still there. They're letting people still live there. So
did your clients, could they discern the tilt? Was it enough to be noticeable? I mean, it's over a long distance, so...
Some units, they could roll, a marble would roll across the floor.
Gosh.
Things like that. I don't think there was any major cracking. There was in the basement. They saw cracking. That was sort of the tip-off. And, I mean, let's face it, any area in San Francisco, if you were to put a laser up on the corner of the building, you detect some tilt. They're not straight as an arrow up there. But this one, of course, the notoriety it has now is just because the very fact that you asked me about that building means it's nationally notorious for what's happening.
It's a personal interest of mine because what I think is interesting, and I've learned this since my editor's job, is that engineers don't have consensus about stuff. They disagree. And like in other professions, low bid often gets the job, right?
Yeah, low bids, and in the design field where you're designing, especially a unique building on, I would say, a fairly unique piece of property, uh, it takes a very good design not to have repercussions. And this one, I think, was shortchanged at the design stage. And now we're doing it all over again, trying to design the fix. And there's disagreement, huge disagreement among engineers as to what's going to work. And I feel bad for the building department of the city of San Francisco that has to decide between all of these competing opinions as to what's the right thing to do out there, because they have to permit the job. I wouldn't want to be in there.
And keep the people in downtown safe, right? I mean, this is like just the infrastructure disruption from the fix has got to create hazards for pedestrians and cars. I can't imagine.
We're close to it. They're all blocked off, all fenced off where they're working. But yeah, it's a big mess.
Wow. So, your own house. Do you got any projects coming up? Do you like to work on it yourself? You mentioned an interest. That means a lot of things, right?
Years ago, I used to do all my own work. My dad was a very skilled guy that built houses and things like that. I learned from him. I used to do all my own work. But there came to be a time when my appreciation for good work exceeded my capabilities. and I know bad work when I see it. And I did a lot of rehab of houses and things. And I gradually began to realize that I wasn't the greatest. I didn't have the skill set that I needed to get the kind of result that I wanted. So now I'm sort of like a handyman. I go around and fix things, but I don't do any major projects anymore.
Do you still find it enjoyable to fix stuff? I bet you do.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'll tell you, one of the greatest tools that have been given to us is YouTube. I had a refrigerator, a freezer drawer on my refrigerator handle just broke off, came off in my hands. And I'm sitting there looking at it. I'm thinking, how am I going to put this together? Am I going to call the appliance guy and have him come over? But you go, honest to God, you go on YouTube, put in freezer door handle repair for this particular kind of freezer. By God, there was a step-by-step repair. I ordered the part and could put it together. Yeah, it's kind of a challenge. It's kind of fun.
I've greatly enjoyed talking to you. Were you familiar with the Fine Homebuilding brand before you agreed to do this?
With your podcast?
Well, with Fine Homebuilding magazine and website and the media company.
I've seen it. I haven't. I don't subscribe to it, but I've seen it. I've picked them up from time by time. Yeah, I think they're great. I think we need to bring these kind of things to the attention of a lot of people.
Anything you want to ask or tell our audience before we part company, Tyler?
I just think that owners of multifamily buildings need to inspect them early and better to head off the problems, because at the end of their life, and they do have a service life, there's no plan for what to do with them, and the folks end up owning a building that's deteriorating, and they can't raise the money to fix it, and there's no plan for the future. Let's put it that way. And I think that would be my one biggest piece of advice to the owners of those buildings: inspect them early and often.
I'd say the same to the builders building them too, because you could be on the hook for fixing it, which is way more expensive than doing it right the first time.
It's even worse than that, because insurance companies now are becoming very reluctant to insure builders and developers the way they used to, because of the defects leading to litigation and settlements. So it's tougher for a developer to get insurance. Big developers get it. They have to put a big deductible down. But small guys, it's hard for them to get adequate insurance. because of just the reputation, not theirs particularly, the reputation of the home building industry leading to defects. Of course, as lawyers, we're accused of making all this up. It's not true. We're just in it for whatever attorney's fees we can get out of it. But the insurance companies would not settle these cases if they didn't see evidence of problems. And so that's my best evidence.
Tyler Berding, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Tyler Berding for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Thanks very much for listening.